there really aren't very many treatments for drug addiction. In fact, there's maybe just a handful, mostly for drugs like opium and heroin. But we had the idea to try to treat stimulant drugs like methamphetamine and a drug called angel dust or phencyclidine. And since there were no medical treatments for it, we decided to work on something that was entirely novel at the time, and that was to use vaccinations, either with preformed medicines called monoclonal antibodies or as active vaccines in the form of immunizing. Well, we're still working on it to this day, but now we're very close after taking our first medication forward to the FDA in a pre-IND meeting to see whether they would accept the concept, and they did. And now we're even closer to a second one and more important one for a drug called methamphetamine, which worldwide is a major epidemic, and much of the crime and violence in the U.S. related to drug abuse is related to methamphetamine use. And since there's no treatment for that other than perhaps putting someone in prison, that's where we put most of the drug abusers that have the really serious problems, there's not been a medicine. So we have a couple of goals. We want to make a medicine to treat drug abuse. We want it to be novel, and we want to have, most of all, an impact on human health. And at this point in my career, that's the biggest point, to change the strategy, to change the way in which we treat this disorder, addiction, with a medicine which we haven't had before. So our approach is two-pronged. We use passive antibodies, which are preformed, high-tech, engineered antibodies that we can give and get immediate protection, or a more traditional vaccine. Both of these would be used to treat someone once they already are addicted. This is not meant to treat children to sometimes in the future if they'll get an addiction or start using a drug like cocaine or methamphetamine, but it's meant to treat them once they already have the disease or using the drug. Our medical goals for treating addiction are to decrease or block exposure in the brain, lessen the medical impact of abuse, and we found that in general in our animal studies, which are the preclinical, the pre-human use, this helps both the general well-being of the animal and their general health, which also helps them in good decision making. And so in conjunction with relearning behaviors like what sets me off to use drugs, or what peer groups am I around who leads to drug abuse, together with a medicine like this, we think it could increase the patient's willpower to quit drugs and aid in the initiation and continuation of more positive behaviors. For instance, most of us know about cigarette smoking. The average person probably takes at least 10 very serious tries before they'll give it up, if they can give it up. And Mark Twain said 100 years ago, he already understood how to treat addiction. He said, giving up smoking is the easiest thing in the world. I've done it 100 times, and therein lies the problem. So we hope we can reduce that to just a few tries to blunt those effects and keep them from going back to the drugs. And thereby we prevent this relapse and get them off of it instead of having to put them in the prison. So in a slide that I have on the screen, we show the bloodstream on the left side in which the drug in little yellow circles is circulating through the brain. And it goes in the brain and where it acts on different receptors and neurons in the brain. But it's mostly in, as you see the arrow, and very little is coming back out. But in the presence of our antibodies, they associate with this drug and keep it from going into the brain and shift this equilibrium so it comes out of the brain. We find in animals that when we give them drugs like methamphetamine, within 30 seconds the brain concentrations are already 8 times higher in the bloodstream. So it's a huge impact on the brain. So there's a number of important chemicals we're working with in terms of phencyclidine or angel dust is one, but then there's also methamphetamine, which is highly addictive, amphetamine, a metabolite, a breakdown product, which is also a drug. And then the other drug which our antibodies work for, or the class abbreviation is MDMA, and that's ecstasy. That's what kids take at rave parties and dance and are very stimulated and get in trouble and have overdoses. So we're working on all of those. Our antibodies work against all of these molecules. And we make these antibodies by starting out with the drugs, like meth or methamphetamine, and then we put a linker on it, which allows us to put it onto a protein and make an antigen, just like you get a vaccination against the H1N1 virus or hepatitis or some other sorts of infectious disease. We can immunize and create usable titers which will blunt the effect. This is a prototype look at what basic structure looks like of the molecule. You can see the drug bound in the binding site, so this is a very refined molecular analysis of the binding, and even another blow-up of how it interacts with the binding site. And through this, we can re-engineer the proteins to make them even better. And in this slide, we look at a high and a low affinity antibody in animals in which you'll see on the left is the distance they travel over a 2 hour under the influence of this drug. And if we just give them like water or a buffer called saline, just a salt solution, in the silver lines there, we show that they don't go very far. They maybe go about 25 meters over a period of a couple of hours. But if we give them methamphetamine in the magenta colored one, they go about 300 meters in this period of time. But if we treat them with the antibody, called MAB or monoclonal antibody, it can reduce these effects by 70%. That's quite substantial. And in the right part of the slide, I show where another antibody, which isn't as good as this one, only reduces the effects by 30%. So we keep working on higher and higher affinity antibodies to make these very, very effective. And another advantage of the antibodies, and just as a prototype slide here, but is that the antibodies would probably, if they were given as monoclonal antibodies, they're going to last probably 3 weeks at a time. So patients would have to come in for a treatment once every 3 or 4 weeks as opposed to every day. And so patient compliance, the ability, these patients aren't the best in complying. So a big feature of this is that they would have very infrequent treatments. And if they missed that treatment by a few days, it really wouldn't matter. So their long action is a major advantage. So another type of therapy that we're working on, as opposed to the preformed antibodies or monoclonal antibodies, which we could give just like a medicine, and this is already in use for cancer treatment and people that have autoimmune diseases, but we're trying to develop it for the addiction treatments. But another approach that we're taking is to do active immunization, and it would have the advantages of we would make a vaccine, which we would immunize someone with, and then over a period of a month or two, they would get very significant titers. And that titer means the circulating amount of antibody. And this is a much less expensive method, but the duration in which the antibodies would be in the bloodstream at high concentration in clinical trials looks like it's only a couple of months. So there's a very small window of opportunity in which you can match effective blocking amounts of antibody with the behavioral modification you're going to have to do. So we're looking at ways to extend the time of that. And so we're funded in these two broad areas. And so our passion for this is that we'd like to have an impact on human health. We'd like to develop a medicine that could be, society changing. And so instead of putting everybody in prison, which is a viable approach for really, really bad people, but not everybody needs to be in treatment. And instead of spending on the war on drugs more than we do on the entire NIH budget, we could get people back in the community and contributing and to give up their addiction. And this is where we're headed.